Hey there, it's Nick from NAJA Woodworking, and welcome to the start of a brand new build. And this one's going to be really exciting because it's actually our first commission project. So before we begin, let me walk you through real quick what the client's actually asking for. So for this project, the client gave me this little white battery operated light, and they said, hey, I want to use this in a wedding, and specifically what I want to do is find a way to encase it in some type of wood, but with a hole drilled into the top of the wood so that the light can shine through and illuminate some drink that's going to be displayed at the bar, making it glow in the darkness of the reception area. And so I have this Miles Craft circular cutting jig, which I've had in the shop for a little while, but never got to use it. And I thought, well, this seems like the perfect time. So the first thing I did, and this took a lot of testing to figure out how I was going to do this, I made sure that the jig worked and that I could actually cut circles. But in order to have the light encased, I realized I was also going to have some type of inlaid inner circle inside of the circle that I already cut out so that the light can fit into it like you see here. And then I would make some type of similar top piece to put over it so that the whole light would be properly encased. Once I had a game plan, I toyed around with using some different woods, I toyed around with rounded edges to make it more decorative, and there was just a lot of trial and error with this project. But finally what I was able to do is come up with what you see here. This was made out of scrap walnut, and this ended up being the perfect design for the job that I needed it to do. I'm going to show you exactly how I made this in the video, and our goal here is to actually make an even better one because I learned a lot while I was making this. Alright, so that's what we got to do. We got everything we need. Let's get building. Alright, so for this build, we're basically going to divide it into two parts. So looking at what I have here, first you look at the bottom and realize you're going to need to cut a ring out of the wood that you're working with. And then if you flip it over, we'll focus on the top, and what you need to do there is basically cut out a circle, flip it over, and then find a way to cut out an inlaid circle on the other side. You get those two pieces, glue them together, and you have your finished result, more or less, other than cleaning it up and making it look all pretty. Now, when you're working with this jig, the reason I said there was so much trial and error in this project, this jig was made to cut circles out of wood. So that plywood you see in front of me and that circle that was cut out of it, that's all the jig was made to do. You screw it in with that center hole, you spin it around with your router and lower the router bit by bit, and eventually you get a circle cut out. It wasn't made to do inlaid circles, and it wasn't made to do rings. So in order to do that, I had to get creative. So what I'm doing here is just kind of showing you what I needed to figure out when I was doing all of these tests. When you cut the circle out, it's no longer attached to the board that you cut it out of. So if you go to cut out the outer ring like you see me tracing there, the problem is because your center circle is no longer attached to the wood, it's going to be shaking around, and so as you're cutting out that outer circle, it's going to be all wobbly and you're not going to get a perfectly even ring. So I needed to figure out a way that that wasn't going to happen. So what I decided to do is I got rid of the screw that came with the jig, which was very tiny, and instead I put in a different screw, which was going to be long enough to go all the way through my walnut. Under the walnut, I put a piece of plywood, and the idea here is that the screw is going to go all the way through the walnut and sink into the plywood below. That way, what I'm going to do, as you'll see in a moment, is I'm going to cut the inner circle out first, then the board's still going to be attached via that screw, and then without removing the jig, I'm going to change the jig's diameter to cut out the outer circle and then go ahead and cut that as well. And while I'm doing that, it's important to note my board needs to be absolutely fixed in place so that that center hole is always fixed. So I'm going to drill a couple pilot holes here so that I can attach my walnut to my plywood via a couple countersunk screws. The reason I'm using countersunk screws is because as that jig swings around in a circle, I don't want it getting stuck on any exposed screw heads. Alright, so now that we got our boards in place, we're going to have to set up the jig. Now, if you're using the same jig as me, you're going to want to read the instructions to make sure you're setting it up properly and that you know how to use it. But essentially what I'm doing here is adjusting it so that the first circle I cut is the exact diameter that I need in order to house the light, which is just over 2.5 inches. Now the jig also comes with a 1/4 inch straight routing bit, so I'm going to go ahead and pop that into my router, And finally, you're going to have to use a different base plate in order for your router to fit into the jig. So I removed the base plate that came with mine, and then I'm going to go ahead and pop on this circular base plate instead. Again, the instructions for the jig tell you exactly how to do this in the proper way, so I'm not going to explain that all here, but rest assured I read the instructions and I got the base plate swapped, and now we're ready to use it. Alright, so the first thing I need to do is drill my center hole exactly where I want the circle to be, and then via the screw I'm just going to attach the jig to the walnut, and you can see there it spins around nice and perfectly. I attached the router since I swapped the base plates, put the battery in, and now we're good to go. I'm also going to put my hat on so my hair stays out of my face. I'm going to put in my earplugs and my glasses, make sure we're set, and everything's looking good. Alright, so now to actually using this jig, it's very straightforward once you figure out kind of what it is you're doing. So I'm just spinning it around in a circle that, again, has a diameter of 2.5 inches, a little bit over, and every time I make one complete revolution, I'm going to lower the router by about 1/8 of an inch, give or take. I'm not doing exact measurements here, but that's all there is to it. You just go around in a circle, lower the router a little further, and just keep going around until you've made it all the way through the board. You'll know when you're through the board because you'll either feel it or you'll notice a difference in the sawdust coming up. Now once you're all the way through, this is probably the trickiest part in cutting out a ring with this jig. You need the jig to stay in the exact same spot that it was in, because that's what's going to give you concentric circles. So without removing the jig, I simply need to change the diameter to cut for the outer diameter of the ring instead of the inner like we just did. So I need this to stay in place as best I can. You're going to see at the end of this, it actually ended up not being exactly perfect. It was maybe off by 1/16 of an inch, which was okay for the build. But still, you want to be as careful here as you can. And so you can see here, all I've done is adjust the jig so that I'm cutting at a different diameter, and now we're ready to cut our next circle. Alright, so with the jig adjusted to cut the outer circle of the ring and the router put back in place, I'm going to go ahead and keep doing exactly what I did for the inner circle. Now, for this jig, the reason they recommend using a plunge router is so that every time you make a revolution, you just plunge it down by 1/8 of an inch. Since I don't have a plunge router, it was a little trickier, but it wasn't impossible. Basically, every time I finished a lap, I had to manually adjust my router and just sink it down a little bit. You don't want to go too far down per cut because that's just going to make you do a much more aggressive cut. It's going to be a lot rougher. You're going to get burn marks. So just when you're doing this, especially a delicate little piece of wooden art like I'm making here, you just want to be as slow and steady as you possibly can. And speaking of steady, what actually ended up happening in this build, after I finished this cut, I found out that my jig was slightly broken. The screw hole that's supposed to anchor the jig to the board got a little bit warped. It almost tore completely. And what I found is that that caused my circles that I tried really hard to make perfectly concentric ended up being slightly off by about 1/16 of an inch. Now luckily I kept the ring and I decided to see if it would work in the end, and it did, because that error was just so slight that it didn't affect the accuracy of the build. But be careful when you're doing this because you do want to try to get as perfect as possible. And I guess this was kind of expected because, like I said at the beginning, I'm technically not using the jig per the factory instructions because I'm not cutting out just a circle, I'm cutting out a ring. So I had to change the screw, I had to get a little bit creative, so it's understandable that things aren't going to work perfectly. Anyway, after I made all of those passages, I removed the jig, and voila, look at this beautifully cut walnut ring that we have right here. I went to grab the light to make sure that it fit, and it actually was a perfectly snug fit. Now we're ready to start cutting out the top part of our project. So the first thing I did was flipped over the walnut and then reattached it to the plywood. That was because I wanted the surface that I had previously been looking at to be the top of the build, and so I needed to flip it around because what I'm doing here is essentially cutting it out upside down. Now, I need my jig to be cut at the exact same diameter that I just finished the outer ring at so that they can line up perfectly. So without actually adjusting the jig, I simply put it into my new screw hole, put the router in, and then I'm going to start routing it out. Now, it's really important here. I'm not going to go all the way through. In fact, I'm not even going to go close to all the way through. Instead, I'm just going to mark out my path, and then I'm going to leave it for later. Now what I'm going to do is adjust the router back to that 2.5 inch diameter, and I'm going to start carving out the inner circle. And for the inner circle, I don't want to go all the way through the wood, but I want to go pretty far. So if you're using a 3/4 inch piece of wood, I might give it 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch leeway. So that's what I'm doing there, is measuring to see how far down I actually went. And once I was satisfied, I removed the jig to show you what it is I'm doing. And that's exactly what you see here. So we have our outer ring carved out, not all the way through, but just enough to mark our place. And then we have our inner ring carved through, not all the way through the wood, but pretty close. So now what we need to do in order to do a properly inlaid circle is we need to take just our router without the jig and slowly carve out this inner circle that you see here, going very slowly and carefully on each pass. Alright, so we're going to remove the router from the jig, and we're going to start carving out that inner circle. And our goal here is to essentially carve it out to as deep down as that inner ring goes so that the two surfaces become perfectly flush. They don't have to be exact, but they need to be as close as you can make it. And you'll see exactly what I mean by that once we're done making this cut. So again, I'm just going to go very slowly routing out that inner circle. Each time I'm done, I'm going to go down by about 1/8 of an inch. You want to be really careful because after all this work, the last thing you want is to go down too far, have a bit of tear out, and then carve out that perfect outer surface that you've been working so hard at carving out. Trust me, I know, because while I was testing this method out, I unfortunately did that twice. So don't be like me. Go slow, be patient, and just keep working. And I want to make a call out here because I think it's kind of funny. I don't have a shop vac, and you'll notice that each time I make a pass, I have all this sawdust trapped in here. And if you can't see what I'm using to get rid of it, it's actually my leaf blower. I don't have an air compressor. I don't have a shop vac. No, that's right. I'm just using a leaf blower to remove all the sawdust. So if you ever want to help support the channel so that I can buy lumber and new tools and just make the shop that much more efficient, there is a Patreon that you're more than welcome to join, become a patron, and get access to some cool benefits, and you'll help support the channel along the way. Alright, so we're just going to keep carving out this inner circle until we can get as close as possible to flush with our bottom surface. And once I was satisfied, I'll show you what I have here. You can see that there is a very tiny lip in there, but that is completely acceptable, and it's not going to cause a problem with this build. And so now that our inside part is ready to go, all we need to do is finish cutting all the way through our outside circle so that the top part becomes disattached from the wood. So I'm going to readjust my jig, line it up into the pre-existing carve out that I already have there. Ah, that's why I did that earlier. Never would have guessed. And then once I get all the way through, I'm going to remove the jig, and voila, there's the top part of our build. Alright, so before I glue this up, I'm just going to expand the hole that's already drilled into the top. I'm going to make it 3/8 of an inch. Now I'm ready for the glue up, so I'm going to go ahead and align it so that I get a grain pattern that I like. Went ahead and marked that with a pencil, cleared away my sawdust, and then I'm going to be using Type Bond 3, not for any particular reason, that's just the only glue that I currently have in the shop. Apply a little bit to the inner and, or I guess both inner rims, and then get it aligned. And then it's a little tricky because of how tiny this is, but I went ahead and clamped it the best that I could. I clamped it from the sides, and then I clamped it from the tops and bottoms to try to get even pressure, and wiped away any excess glue that I could get my hands on. While that was drying, I grabbed my round-over bit for the router. You'll notice that I also reattached the default base plate for this. And now I'm going to go ahead and clean this thing up, make it look all pretty. I'm going to do round over edges on the top, and I'm going to do round over edges on the bottom, both on the outer and inner rims, to just make it nice and sleek all around. Now it's time for everyone's favorite part of the job, and that is sanding. I grabbed these kind of malleable sanding sponges from my local lumber shop. I used those to be delicate with it, and then I also used my orbital sander and just made handheld passes like I did there. Tried to be careful so that I didn't alter the symmetry of the circle in any way, and as long as I didn't press too hard or focus on one spot for too long, it turned out pretty nicely. I kept increasing the grit as I went and worked my way all the way up to 220 until I got this nice smooth thing that you see here. Now I'll go ahead and give you all an unfinished preview. You can see that the light shines perfectly through the top. The rounded edges just give it a nice, beautiful, decorative look, and that light fits in there ever so snugly. Alright, so the last thing to do is to finish this bad boy, and I'm going to make that walnut really pop by using a few coats of shellac. In between the coats, I went ahead and sanded off camera, and then once the thing was finished and had a few days to cure, I did one final sanding to call it a day. And now, ladies and gentlemen, let me show you what this looks like when all is said and done. Now, it might not look like a lot with the lights on, but when I turn off the lights, it'll look like this, and when we take a delightful adult beverage and put it on top, you can see just how beautiful the end product is and how nice the drink looks. This is going to look really cool at a wedding bar. The couple should be very happy. I think they're going to love it. And now let's head to the outro. I'm very happy with how this turned out. Really happy with how creative I got with the tools that I had. And I learned a lot. I did a lot of new building techniques with this project, and I had a lot of fun. So anyway, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Like and subscribe, all that stuff. Feel free to support on Patreon so that we can, you can help fund the shop and help get new tools, new lumber, all that type of stuff. And otherwise, stay tuned. Really excited for what's to come next, and I'll see you later.